at 60 years old. Walter Hayes thought he already knew how his story ended. After more than 3 decades working for the same utility company, he expected to finish his career quietly, collect a modest pension, and spend his remaining years trying not to become a burden to anyone. It wasn't a glamorous future, but it was a future. Then, in a single afternoon, it disappeared. A company restructuring eliminated his position. His retirement savings weren't enough. His pension was smaller than promised. His wife had been gone for years. His daughter lived her own life. And for the first time since he was a teenager, Walter woke up every morning with nowhere he needed to be. He told people he was fine. The truth was far different. He felt forgotten, like the world had quietly moved on without him. Then a lawyer called. A distant uncle he barely knew had died and left him something unexpected. Not money, not land, not investments. An abandoned fire lookout tower sitting alone on a remote mountain ridge. The structure had no electricity, no running water, and no practical value. Everyone gave Walter the same advice. Sell it, walk away, forget it ever existed. But after climbing the mountain and unlocking the tower for the first time, he discovered something strange. An old Forest Service radio sitting beneath layers of dust. A radio that should not have worked anymore. Yet somehow, it did. At first, the radio produced nothing but static. Then one evening, as a storm rolled through the mountains, Walter heard a voice, a real voice, calling out through the crackling airwaves using a call sign that hadn't officially existed in decades. The transmission led him toward a mystery buried deep within the mountains, a forgotten rescue operation, missing records, hidden journals, and a group of ordinary people whose courage had been erased from history. What Walter eventually uncovered would change the lives of dozens of families and give him something he thought he had lost forever. A reason to wake up every morning. Because sometimes the most important call of your life doesn't arrive when you're young. Sometimes it arrives when everyone else believes your story is already over. Before we climb that mountain and hear the first impossible voice on the radio, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. What city, state, or country are you watching from? And what time is it where you are right now? Leave a comment below and let us know. I always enjoy seeing how many different places these stories reach around the world. Whether you're starting your morning, finishing a long day, or listening late at night, I hope you're doing well and that something good finds its way to you today. And if you enjoy stories about mysterious inheritances, forgotten history, hidden discoveries, second chances, and ordinary people uncovering extraordinary secrets, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future stories. If you notice any details that could be improved, feel free to leave a comment as well. Your feedback helps make every story better. Now, let's go back to the day Walter Hayes lost his job, inherited a lonely fire lookout tower, and heard a voice on a radio that should have gone silent decades ago. Walter Hayes carried the cardboard box through the parking lot more slowly than he needed to. Inside were 35 years of small possessions collected across a career that had once seemed permanent. A coffee mug with a faded company logo, a framed photograph of his wife taken years before cancer stole her from him, a flashlight, a few maintenance manuals, the kind of items people leave behind when they assume they will be returning tomorrow. Except Walter wasn't returning. The utility company where he had worked since his 20s no longer needed him, officially. The layoff was part of a restructuring initiative. The younger manager delivering the news had spoken carefully, reading phrases from prepared notes about efficiency, modernization, and changing business needs. Walter remembered very little of the conversation. Mostly, he remembered the uncomfortable expression on the young man's face. The look people wore when they knew they were delivering bad news, but didn't want to be blamed for it. 35 years. Gone in less than 15 minutes. He loaded the box into his pickup truck and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. Employees continued walking in and out of the building. Some waved. Most avoided eye contact. Nobody knew what to say. Walter couldn't blame them. He wasn't sure what to say either. For the first time since he was 24 years old, he had nowhere he needed to be tomorrow morning. The realization followed him home. 3 weeks later, it had not left. Every morning he woke at 6 out of habit. Every morning he made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and stared out the window overlooking the small backyard. The routine remained. The purpose did not. The pension meeting only made things worse. Walter sat across from a retirement advisor half his age, while spreadsheets and projections filled a computer screen. The numbers weren't disastrous. They just weren't enough. Rising costs had quietly reduced the value of everything he thought he had spent decades building toward. Retirement suddenly looked less like freedom and more like careful budgeting. You'll need to be mindful of discretionary spending, the advisor explained. Walter nodded while staring at the figures. Mindful. It was a polite way of saying there wouldn't be much room for mistakes. Driving home afterward, he found himself gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. He had spent years fixing problems for other people. Power outages, storm damage, equipment failures. There was always something to repair, something useful to do. Now the days stretched endlessly ahead. Empty. Silent. His daughter Sarah called occasionally. She lived 3 states away with a demanding job and 2 children. Walter loved hearing from her, yet every conversation felt shorter than the last, not because she didn't care, because life moved fast. People had responsibilities, schedules, families. Walter understood. Still, after each phone call ended, the house felt quieter. One rainy Thursday afternoon, he found himself standing in the garage, staring at old tools. He wasn't looking for anything. He simply couldn't think of another way to spend the day. The silence felt heavier lately. The house felt larger. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider a thought he had been avoiding. Maybe this was it. Maybe the most important part of his life was already behind him. He sat on a stool beside an old workbench and stared at nothing for several minutes. The loneliness surprised him, not because it existed, because it arrived so quickly. His phone rang just before dinner. Unknown number. Walter almost ignored it. Most unfamiliar calls lately involved insurance offers or extended vehicle warranties. Something made him answer anyway. "Walter Hayes," a man asked. "Speaking. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm an attorney with Mercer and Reed." Walter frowned. "Can I help you?" "Actually, Mr. Hayes, I'm calling regarding the estate of Harold Finch." The name triggered a vague memory. Family reunions decades ago. A tall man with a weathered face who rarely spoke. An uncle on his mother's side. Walter hadn't seen him in years. Harold passed away 3 months ago. Walter sat up slightly. "I'm sorry to hear that." He left specific instructions regarding an inheritance. Walter blinked. Inheritance? Yes. Papers shuffled on the other end of the line. "Mr. Finch has left you ownership of his property in Granite Peak County." Walter laughed softly. "There must be some mistake." "No mistake." The attorney paused. The property consists primarily of an old mountain fire lookout tower. Walter wasn't sure he heard correctly. A what? A former Forest Service fire lookout. The deed transfer is already prepared. Silence followed. Walter tried to imagine why anyone would leave him a fire lookout tower. Nothing about the idea made sense. I barely knew Harold. Even so, he was very specific. The attorney cleared his throat. He also left a written instruction. Walter leaned forward. What does it say? More paper rustled. Then the attorney read aloud. Tell Walter not to sell anything until he listens to the radio. Walter frowned. The radio? Those are his exact words. 2 days later, curiosity carried him farther into the mountains than he had traveled in years. The paved road eventually became gravel. The gravel became dirt. The dirt became a narrow, winding track, climbing steadily through dense pine forests. Cell service disappeared more than an hour earlier. By late afternoon, clouds drifted across distant ridgelines while the road continued upward. Walter rounded a final bend and stopped the truck. For several moments, he simply stared through the windshield. The fire lookout stood alone atop a mountain ridge overlooking endless forests and distant peaks, weathered by decades of wind and storms. The structure rose above the trees like a forgotten sentinel. It looked isolated, abandoned, almost impossibly remote. Walter stepped from the truck and gazed at the tower. Then he remembered the attorney's words. Don't sell anything until you listen to the radio. Somewhere inside that lonely mountain lookout waited the first clue to a mystery his uncle had spent a lifetime protecting. Walter slept poorly in the cab of his pickup truck. The mountain air turned colder after sunset, and unfamiliar sounds echoed through the forest throughout the night. Wind moved through the pines. Branches scraped against one another. Something large wandered through the trees sometime after midnight, crunching leaves and snapping twigs before disappearing again. By dawn, Walter felt stiff, tired, and slightly ridiculous. At 60 years old, sleeping in a truck at the base of a mountain wasn't how he imagined spending retirement. Yet when he stepped outside and looked toward the lookout tower standing against the early morning sky, curiosity pushed him forward. The structure appeared even more isolated in daylight, perched on the ridge above thousands of acres of forest. It looked like the last surviving witness to a forgotten era. He started the truck and continued climbing the final stretch of road. The higher he went, the rougher the route became. Deep ruts cut through the dirt. Fallen branches littered several sections. Then, about half a mile below the tower, the road ended abruptly. A recent washout had carved a trench nearly 6 feet deep across the path. Walter stopped and climbed out. He stood at the edge of the damage for several minutes. Even his aging pickup wasn't getting across that. Road's been like that for 2 years. The voice startled him. Walter turned. An older man sat on an ATV parked beneath the trees. He wore a faded ranger hat and a weathered denim jacket. His face looked carved from decades of sun and mountain weather. "Morning," the stranger said. Walter laughed softly. "You almost gave me a heart attack." "Sorry about that." The man climbed off the ATV and walked over. "Name's Ben Ortega." Walter shook his hand. "Walter Hayes." Ben nodded. "Harold's nephew." Walter raised an eyebrow. "You knew my uncle?" "For nearly 40 years. Ben looked toward the tower. "Hard not to know somebody when they're the only other person crazy enough to spend that much time up here." The comment made Walter smile. Together they examined the damaged road. Ben confirmed what Walter already suspected. No vehicle was reaching the lookout until significant repairs were completed. "Guess I'm walking." About 20 minutes from here, Ben shrugged. Maybe 30 if your knees complain as much as mine. The two men started up the trail together. As they climbed, Ben pointed out landmarks hidden among the forest. Old fire breaks, ranger paths, sections of mountain damaged by storms years earlier. The man seemed to know every inch of the landscape. Walter found himself enjoying the conversation more than expected. It had been a long time since he spent an afternoon talking with someone who wasn't trying to sell him something or rush to the next appointment. "How long has the lookout been abandoned?" Walter asked. Ben thought for a moment. "Officially, about 20 years. Walter glanced toward the distant tower. "And Harold stayed up there all that time?" "Most of it." Ben smiled. "Folks thought he was stubborn." "Was he?" "Absolutely." They both laughed. The trail eventually emerged onto the ridge. For the first time, Walter could fully appreciate the view. Mountains stretched endlessly in every direction. Valleys disappeared into the distance. Forests rolled across the landscape like green waves frozen in place. The lookout stood at the highest point, overlooking everything. Despite its age, the structure remained remarkably solid. Weathered, certainly, but standing. Ben noticed Walter studying it. Harold maintained it constantly. Seems like a lot of work for one person. He had reasons. The answer lingered. Several minutes later, they reached the tower itself. Walter unlocked the door using the keys provided by the attorney. The interior smelled faintly of wood, dust, and old paper. Sunlight streamed through windows covering nearly every wall. A narrow bed occupied one corner. Shelves filled another. Maps, notebooks, and equipment sat exactly where Harold left them. The space felt less abandoned than preserved, like its owner had stepped out briefly and planned to return. Ben slowly walked through the room. "Looks about the same." Walter noticed something on a nearby shelf. A stack of unopened envelopes, several addressed to Harold. One particularly thick envelope contained property documents. Curious. He opened it. Inside were copies of purchase offers. Dozens of them. Some from private buyers, others from development groups. The amounts surprised him. People wanted this place? Ben nodded. "More than you'd think." Walter examined the papers. The offers stretched back years. Some were substantial, enough money to make anyone pay attention. Yet every one carried Harold's handwritten response across the front. "No." "He rejected all of them?" Walter asked. "Every single one." Ben leaned against the wall. People kept asking why. "Did he ever tell you?" The old ranger smiled. "Nope." That answer only deepened the mystery. Why preserve a remote fire lookout nobody used anymore? Why refuse every offer? Why leave it to a nephew he barely knew? Walter spent the afternoon exploring. The tower contained old maps, maintenance records, weather logs, and decades of handwritten notes. Many belonged to Harold. Others appeared much older. The deeper he looked, the more questions emerged. Late in the day, while opening cabinets beneath one of the observation windows, Walter discovered a section covered by a canvas tarp. Curious. He pulled it aside. Beneath it sat a large collection of radio equipment. His pulse quickened immediately. Receivers, transmitters, headsets, signal meters. Most looked decades old. Dust covered nearly every surface. Yet, unlike the rest of the equipment, the radio console appeared surprisingly well maintained. Several components looked newer than expected, almost as if someone had continued servicing them long after the lookout was abandoned. Walter stared at the setup. Then he remembered the attorney's message. Don't sell anything until you listen to the radio. For the first time, those words felt less like a strange request and more like a clue. Walter spent the next 3 days cleaning the lookout tower. At first, he told himself, he was only making the place presentable before deciding what to do with it. Deep down, he knew that wasn't entirely true. The truth was simpler. For the first time in months, he had something useful to work on. Every morning he climbed the mountain trail carrying supplies. Every evening he returned to the truck, tired, dirty, and strangely satisfied. He repaired loose boards, cleared debris from the observation deck, organized decades of maps and weather logs. The routine felt familiar, comfortable, like slipping back into an old pair of work boots. By the 4th day, he finally turned his attention to the radio equipment. The console occupied nearly an entire corner of the lookout. Several receivers were clearly obsolete. Dust covered the control panels. Cables disappeared beneath the floor and through the walls. Yet despite its age, the setup looked surprisingly well maintained. Harold had cared for it. That much was obvious. Walter crouched beside the equipment and began inspecting connections. Most of the system lacked power. Several batteries were dead. A solar charging unit mounted outside appeared disconnected. Fortunately, electrical troubleshooting was something he understood. Within a few hours, he identified the problem. Corroded wiring, damaged terminals, a failed regulator. Nothing impossible. As he worked, he found himself wondering why Harold devoted so much effort to maintaining a radio network nobody officially used anymore. Fire lookout systems like this had largely disappeared decades earlier. Modern satellites and digital communications replaced them. Yet Harold had continued maintaining the equipment long after everyone else stopped caring. The question lingered throughout the afternoon. By sunset, Walter had restored power to portions of the system. Small indicator lights flickered on. Signal meters twitched slightly. Static crackled faintly through a speaker. He sat back and smiled, despite himself. "Well," he muttered, "you're alive." The radio responded with a burst of static. Walter laughed. Then he shut everything down and headed home. The following evening, a storm rolled across the mountains. Dark clouds gathered beyond the ridgelines. Wind rattled the lookout windows. Rain tapped against the roof. Walter remained inside, sorting through weather logs while the storm intensified. Occasionally, lightning illuminated the distant forests. The isolation of the tower felt more pronounced during bad weather. Yet strangely, Walter didn't mind. Around 8 o'clock, he powered up the radio system again, mostly out of curiosity. Static immediately filled the room. He adjusted several knobs and switches. More static. Then silence. Then static again. Nothing unexpected. He leaned back in his chair and continued reviewing old maintenance records. Several minutes passed. Then a sound emerged from the speaker. Walter froze. At first, he assumed it was interference. The storm, atmospheric noise. Yet the sound continued. A voice, faint, distorted, real. Walter sat upright immediately. Static crackled around the transmission. Words drifted in and out. Most were impossible to understand. Then a clear phrase emerged. "Ridge Station 7. Walter stared at the radio. His pulse quickened. Another burst of static followed. Then the voice returned. "Ridge Station 7, come in." The transmission faded again. Silence filled the room. Walter waited. Several seconds passed. Then another fragment arrived. Storm moving east. Static swallowed the rest. Walter leaned toward the microphone. Hello? His own voice sounded strange in the empty tower. Can you hear me? Nothing. More static. Then silence. He waited nearly 10 minutes. No further transmission arrived. Finally, he shut off the microphone and sat back. Rational explanations immediately formed in his mind. Old frequencies sometimes carry distant signals under unusual atmospheric conditions. Storms could create strange radio effects. There was probably a simple explanation. Yet something about the transmission bothered him. Specifically, one phrase. Ridge Station 7. The words sounded less like modern communication and more like a call sign. An old one. The next morning, Walter drove into town and found Ben Ortega drinking coffee at a small diner overlooking the highway. The retired ranger listened carefully while Walter described the transmission. Ridge Station 7, Ben repeated. Walter nodded. Does that mean anything to you? The older man became unusually quiet. Actually, it does. Walter leaned forward. What is it? Ben stared through the diner window toward the mountains. That was an old lookout designation. Walter frowned. Old how? Very old. Ben folded his hands. Back when the mountain lookout network was fully operational. The answer immediately captured Walter's attention. Ben explained that decades earlier, individual towers used designated call signs to coordinate weather observations, fire reports, and emergency communications. Most disappeared when the system was retired. And Ridge Station 7? Walter asked. Ben hesitated. That tower hasn't been active since the 70s. Silence settled between them. Walter felt a chill despite the warm coffee. Then who was transmitting? Ben slowly shook his head. That's the question. The mystery stayed with Walter all day. That evening he returned to the lookout, determined to learn more. The transmission could not be ignored. Somewhere inside Harold's records, there had to be an explanation. He spent hours searching shelves, cabinets, and storage compartments. Most contained routine materials, weather reports, maintenance logs, supply inventories. Then, shortly before sunset, he discovered a small wooden chest hidden beneath an observation bench. The lock had long since rusted away. Inside rested several notebooks wrapped carefully in cloth. Walter immediately recognized the handwriting covering the top journal. Harold's. His pulse quickened. The first page contained a date nearly 40 years old. Beneath it, Harold had written a simple title, Mountain Communications Log. Walter turned the page, then another, then another. His eyes widened. The entries referenced radio traffic, call signs, weather reports, emergency communications, and repeatedly, throughout dozens of pages, one designation appeared again and again. Ridge Station 7. Walter looked toward the silent radio equipment across the room. Outside, clouds gathered once more beyond the mountains. Whatever his uncle had been investigating, it clearly involved the transmissions. And judging by the journal in his hands, the mystery was only beginning. Walter spent the next several evenings reading Harold's journal beside the radio console. Outside, autumn winds moved through the mountains. Sunsets painted the distant ridges in shades of gold and crimson. Night arrived quickly at the lookout, wrapping the forests below in darkness. Yet each evening, after lighting a small lantern and making a pot of coffee, Walter opened the journal and disappeared into a world he never knew existed. The notebook was far more than a communications log. Harold had transformed it into a record of mountain life. Every page revealed something new. weather observations mixed with personal stories. Radio transmissions sat beside descriptions of isolated families living deep in remote valleys. Names appeared repeatedly: ranchers, loggers, teachers, volunteer firefighters, people who depended on one another because nobody else was close enough to help. Walter found himself unexpectedly moved by the entries. Growing up, he had always assumed fire lookouts existed to watch for smoke and report wildfires. Harold's journal painted a completely different picture. The towers formed a lifeline connecting scattered communities across hundreds of miles. Operators passed weather warnings, relayed emergency messages, coordinated medical assistance, helped stranded travelers. During storms, they often became the only reliable communication system available. One entry described a young mother trapped by flooding. Another recorded volunteers organizing a search for a missing hunter. Dozens of pages documented ordinary people helping one another through difficult circumstances. The stories felt deeply human. Walter paused frequently while reading. Some entries reminded him of his own career. Years spent fixing outages after storms, long nights restoring power to communities that depended on it. Nobody ever became rich doing those jobs. Yet people needed them. That realization stirred something inside him he had not felt since losing his position. Purpose. A week after discovering the journal, Walter drove into town searching for additional information. The local library occupied an aging brick building near the courthouse. He spent most of the morning reviewing historical records connected to regional fire lookouts. Hours passed with little progress. Then the librarian pointed him towards someone who might help. "You should talk to Emily Carter," she said. "If anyone knows old lookout history, it's her." 2 hours later, Walter found Emily inside a small historical museum, occupying a former train depot. She appeared younger than he expected. Early 30s, dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail, glasses balanced on her head while she sorted archival photographs across a large table. "You're Walter Hayes," she asked after introductions. "The man who inherited Harold Finch's lookout?" Walter smiled. "Word travels fast." Emily laughed. "In mountain towns, faster than internet service." Within minutes, she was asking questions, lots of them, about the tower, the radio, Harold's journals, the mysterious transmission. Walter quickly realized he wasn't speaking with a casual historian. Emily knew the region's lookout network remarkably well. More importantly, she seemed genuinely fascinated by Harold's records. "Can I see the journal?" she asked. The following afternoon, they sat together inside the lookout tower. Emily carefully turned pages while taking notes. Occasionally, she paused to examine names or dates. Several times, her expression changed: curiosity, surprise, concern. "What is it?" Walter asked. Emily pointed toward a section near the middle of the notebook. "This." The entry described a severe mountain storm in October 1974. Harold mentioned multiple lookouts coordinating emergency communications across the region. Volunteer crews moved through dangerous terrain. Roads washed out. Entire communities became isolated. The event appeared repeatedly throughout the journal. Yet something felt unusual. "I've never seen records this detailed," Emily said quietly. Walter leaned forward. "Bad storm. Very bad." She continued reading. More references appeared. Emergency radio traffic, rescue requests, evacuations, supply deliveries. As the pages accumulated, a pattern emerged. The lookout operators weren't working alone. They coordinated a much larger network involving volunteers scattered throughout the mountains. Local residents played critical roles. Ranchers used horses to reach stranded families. Loggers cleared blocked roads. Amateur radio operators relayed messages when official systems failed. Walter frowned. "I don't remember hearing about any of this." Emily nodded slowly. "Neither do most people." The realization created another mystery. Events this significant should have been well documented, yet neither of them recognized the story. Emily spent the next several hours comparing Harold's entries against historical records stored on her laptop. The results were frustrating. Official reports acknowledged the storm. They documented property damage and emergency responses. But the volunteer network described in Harold's journal barely appeared. Entire sections seemed missing. "That doesn't make sense," Emily said. Walter agreed. Harold had devoted dozens of pages to the rescue effort. Detailed names, locations, communications. The official record reduced everything to a handful of paragraphs. As evening approached, another clue surfaced. Multiple journal entries referenced radio logs. According to Harold, every major transmission during the storm had been recorded and archived. Yet none appeared among the materials Walter had found. Emily noticed the references immediately. "Missing radio logs?" Walter nodded. "Think they're important?" Emily looked up. If they still exist, they could verify everything. The answer lingered between them. If Harold believed the logs mattered, there was probably a reason. Together they continued searching the journal. Near the back, folded between two pages, Walter discovered something unexpected. A hand-drawn map. The paper was worn from age, but still readable. Harold had sketched the lookout, surrounding trails, and several nearby structures. One location was circled repeatedly in red pencil. Beside it, he had written 3 words: Storage Shed East. Emily studied the map carefully. "I've never seen this building on any survey." Walter followed her finger. The structure appeared roughly half a mile from the lookout, hidden beyond a ridge. Another note had been scribbled beneath the drawing. Additional logs secured here. Walter's pulse quickened. The missing radio records. Harold apparently knew where they were. Emily looked toward the darkening forest outside the tower windows. "You realize what this means?" Walter nodded slowly. Somewhere in the mountains, hidden beyond the ridge, sat a storage shed containing materials Harold considered important enough to map and preserve. And judging by the urgency in the journal entries, whatever waited inside could explain why the old radio was still receiving voices from the past. The following morning, Walter and Emily left the lookout shortly after sunrise. Harold's map rested carefully folded inside Walter's jacket pocket. The hand-drawn sketch had occupied most of their thoughts since the previous evening. Neither slept particularly well. The possibility that Harold intentionally hid important records somewhere beyond the ridge was difficult to ignore. If the missing radio logs still existed, they might finally explain why the old transmissions mattered so much. A thin layer of fog drifted through the trees as they followed the trail marked on the map. The route was barely visible in places. Fallen branches blocked sections of the path. Years of neglect had allowed undergrowth to reclaim much of the area. More than once, they stopped to compare landmarks against Harold's notes. "He wasn't making this easy," Emily said while stepping over a fallen log. Walter smiled. Maybe he wanted to make sure the right person found it. Nearly an hour later, the forest opened onto a small clearing hidden between rocky slopes. For several moments, neither spoke. A weathered wooden structure stood at the far edge of the clearing. The roof sagged slightly. Moss covered portions of the walls. Young pine trees had grown around the building over the years, partially concealing it from view. The storage shed looked forgotten. Exactly the kind of place someone would overlook for decades. "There it is," Emily said quietly. Walter nodded. "Looks like Harold found a good hiding place." The door resisted at first. Rust and age had practically sealed it shut. Together they pushed until the hinges finally groaned open. Dust filled the air immediately. Sunlight streamed through cracks in the walls, illuminating thousands of particles suspended inside the darkness. For a few moments, all they could do was stare. The shed was packed. Wooden shelves lined every wall. Stacks of boxes filled entire corners. Filing cabinets stood beneath tarps. Maps, notebooks, and storage containers occupied nearly every available surface. Harold had transformed the small building into an archive. "Good Lord," Walter whispered. Emily slowly stepped inside. "This isn't a storage shed." She looked around the room. "It's a record center." The next several hours passed in a blur of discovery. Every box seemed to contain something valuable. Topographic maps covered with handwritten notes, weather reports, emergency communication records, volunteer rosters, supply inventories, correspondence between lookout operators. Harold had preserved everything. More importantly, he organized everything. Labels appeared on nearly every container. Dates, locations, incident names, cross-references. The level of detail bordered on obsessive. Walter couldn't help admiring it. Harold clearly believed these materials mattered. Around midday, Emily opened a long metal filing drawer and froze. "Walter?" He looked up immediately. Her expression told him this was important. Inside the drawer sat dozens of communication logs, original radio transcripts, handwritten message records, emergency coordination forms. The dates matched the 1974 storm described in Harold's journal. "These are it," Emily said. "The rescue records." They spent the afternoon reviewing the files. The deeper they looked, the more remarkable the story became. Official reports described the storm as a severe weather event affecting several mountain communities. Harold's records revealed something far larger. Entire valleys became isolated. Roads disappeared beneath landslides. Power lines failed. Communication systems collapsed. In response, lookout operators coordinated a massive volunteer rescue effort. The radio network became the only reliable connection between communities. Messages flowed continuously between towers. Requests for medicine, reports of stranded families, locations of damaged bridges, supply deliveries, search efforts. Walter found himself captivated. Page after page documented ordinary people stepping forward when help was needed. Ranchers used horses to carry supplies across washed-out terrain. Volunteer crews cleared roads. Residents opened homes to stranded travelers. The network connected everyone. "This should be in history books," Walter said quietly. Emily nodded. "It should." Yet as they continued organizing materials, a problem emerged. Several file sections were incomplete. Entire folders were missing. Labels remained in place, but contents had disappeared. Walter noticed the pattern first. "Something's gone." Emily examined the shelves. More gaps appeared. Critical communication logs, final rescue summaries, coordination reports from the storm's most dangerous days. The missing files all seemed connected to the same period. "Do you think Harold moved them?" Walter asked. Emily slowly shook her head. "Maybe." Yet neither sounded convinced. The gaps felt deliberate, like someone had searched specifically for those records. Frustration grew throughout the afternoon. Every answer seemed to create another question. Fortunately, Harold's habit of documenting everything provided another clue. While reviewing inventory notebooks, Walter discovered detailed archive lists. Every box, every folder, every document. Harold tracked all of it. More importantly, he recorded missing materials. Multiple entries referenced files removed years earlier. Some notes included question marks. Others contained dates and observations. Harold knew certain records had vanished. He had been investigating the disappearances himself. The realization sent a chill through Walter. His uncle wasn't simply preserving history. He was trying to solve a mystery. By sunset, they carried several boxes back to the lookout for closer examination. Exhaustion settled into Walter's shoulders. Yet beneath the fatigue, excitement continued building. The rescue network was real. The records proved it. The missing files clearly mattered. And somewhere within Harold's archive, the remaining answers almost certainly existed. After dinner, Emily returned to town while Walter stayed behind at the tower. He spent another hour reviewing communication logs before finally heading to bed. Wind rattled the windows shortly after midnight. Walter woke briefly, listened to the storm outside, and rolled over. Then a sound pulled him fully awake. A floorboard creaked. Not outside. Inside the lookout, Walter sat upright immediately. The room was dark. For several seconds he listened carefully. Another noise followed. Soft, deliberate. Someone was moving through the tower below the observation level. His pulse quickened. Slowly, he reached for the flashlight beside the bed. Then he heard it. The unmistakable sound of a cabinet door closing somewhere in the darkness. Someone had entered the lookout, and they were searching for something. Walter gripped the flashlight tightly and remained perfectly still. The lookout was silent again. Wind pressed softly against the windows. Floorboards creaked occasionally as the old structure shifted in the darkness. Yet he knew what he had heard. Someone had been inside. The sound of the cabinet door was unmistakable. For several seconds he listened carefully. Nothing. Then he switched on the flashlight and climbed quietly down from the sleeping area. The beam cut through the darkness. Maps hung motionless on the walls. Chairs sat where he had left them. The radio console occupied its corner beside the windows. Everything appeared normal, yet the feeling that someone had recently been there refused to leave. Walter checked every room, every storage compartment, and every corner of the tower. No intruder remained. No broken window. No forced door. Eventually, he reached the archive boxes brought back from the storage shed. Several containers sat slightly out of alignment. Not enough for a casual observer to notice. More than enough for Walter. Someone had opened them. By dawn, he was certain of one thing. The visitor had not come randomly. They had been searching. Emily arrived shortly after 9 o'clock, carrying coffee and a notebook. The moment she saw Walter's face, she knew something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked. Walter explained everything. The noises, the disturbed boxes, the late-night search. Emily listened without interrupting. Together, they spent the morning reviewing the archive materials. The deeper they looked, the stranger the situation became. Nothing was missing. Every map remained, every communication record, every journal, every folder. Yet several specific boxes had clearly been handled. More importantly, they all related to the same period of history, the 1974 storm. "Whoever came here wasn't stealing," Emily said. Walter nodded. They were looking. The realization unsettled both of them. If someone was searching for records connected to the rescue operation, then the story was more important than either initially believed. They spent hours comparing inventory lists against Harold's archive notes. Fortunately, Harold's habit of documenting everything continued proving useful. Every box had a reference number. Every folder appeared in a master inventory. Even minor materials were tracked. The more Walter studied the records, the more impressed he became with his uncle's dedication. Harold hadn't simply collected documents. He had built a system. Around midday, Emily discovered a locked metal cabinet hidden behind several shelves. Unlike the larger archive containers, this cabinet appeared personal. Walter found a key taped beneath a drawer exactly where Harold's notes suggested it would be. Inside sat dozens of envelopes, bundled together with string. Handwritten letters. Personal correspondence. For several moments, neither spoke. They had finally found something different. Something not intended as an official record. Walter carefully opened the first bundle. The letters belonged to Harold. Some were written by former lookout operators. Others came from local residents, retired Forest Service employees, volunteer rescuers, and community leaders. Together, they revealed an entirely different side of the man Walter barely remembered. Harold emerged from the pages as thoughtful, persistent, and deeply loyal. More importantly, he had spent decades investigating the events surrounding the storm. Several letters described his frustration with historical accounts that ignored volunteer contributions. Others referenced attempts to recover missing records. Again and again, one theme appeared. Certain people were being forgotten. Emily paused while reading a letter dated nearly 30 years earlier. "Listen to this." Walter looked up. She read aloud. "The official report lists equipment, agencies, and expenditures. It barely mentions the residents who carried supplies, cleared roads, and saved lives. History should remember all of them." Silence settled between them. Walter stared at the paper. The sentence felt personal, not angry, not political, simply disappointed. Harold clearly believed something important had been left out. As they continued reading, additional clues emerged. Correspondence between former lookout operators repeatedly referenced discrepancies between radio records and published summaries. Some communications described volunteer rescue teams that never appeared in official reports. Others mentioned local residents who coordinated evacuations despite receiving no recognition afterward. The pattern became impossible to ignore. The storm history had not been completely erased. It had been selectively simplified. Official agencies deserved credit for their work, yet many volunteers who risked their lives seemed to vanish from the final narrative. Emily leaned back in her chair. "This explains why Harold kept digging." Walter nodded slowly. "He wasn't trying to prove a conspiracy." "No." Emily glanced around the lookout. "He was trying to tell the full story." The realization deepened Walter's respect for the uncle he barely knew. Harold spent years preserving voices most people overlooked, not because he expected recognition, because he believed it mattered. The afternoon passed quickly. They reviewed letters, compared notes, and cross-referenced names against the rescue records from the storage shed. Occasionally, they paused for coffee or conversation. Gradually, the investigation became something more than research. Walter found himself looking forward to Emily's visits. Her curiosity balanced his practicality. Her enthusiasm filled the quiet spaces that had dominated his life since retirement. Several times they caught themselves laughing over obscure details buried inside old documents. The companionship felt surprisingly natural. Near sunset, Walter returned to the radio equipment. One detail from Harold's correspondence continued bothering him. Multiple letters referenced secure storage beneath station equipment. The phrase appeared repeatedly but without explanation. Emily noticed the same thing. Maybe he meant the shed. Walter slowly shook his head. The wording doesn't fit. He crouched beside the radio console and examined the structure more carefully. The equipment occupied a custom-built cabinet extending beneath the observation windows. At first glance, it looked solid. Then he noticed slight differences in the wood grain near the base. A hidden seam. His pulse quickened. Emily. She immediately joined him. Together they inspected the panel. After several minutes, Walter discovered a concealed latch tucked behind an access plate. The mechanism released with a soft click. A narrow section of wood shifted outward. Both froze. Hidden beneath the radio console sat a small steel lockbox secured inside a recessed compartment. Dust covered its surface. The metal appeared decades old. No label, no markings. Just a locked container hidden directly beneath the very radio Harold had instructed Walter to listen to. Emily stared at it. Walter did the same. Whatever answers remained hidden inside the lookout. Harold had gone to extraordinary lengths to protect them. And suddenly, neither of them cared how late it was getting. Walter and Emily carried the lockbox to the small table near the lookout windows. Outside, the last light of day faded behind the mountains. The forest below disappeared into shadow, while the sky turned deep shades of orange and purple. Neither spoke much. The box resting between them felt important. More important than anything they had discovered so far. Harold had hidden it beneath the radio console itself. Whatever was inside had been deliberately protected. Walter examined the metal surface. Like the previous clues, Harold had left almost no explanation. No label, no note, just a small combination dial mounted on the front. Emily folded her arms. Any ideas? Walter thought for a moment. Then he smiled. Actually, maybe. Harold rarely did anything randomly. Throughout the journals and correspondence, certain dates appeared repeatedly. One date in particular surfaced again and again. October 17, 1974, the day the mountain storm reached its peak. Walter carefully entered the numbers. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then a soft click echoed inside the box. Emily laughed quietly. I think your uncle liked puzzles. Walter lifted the lid. Both immediately leaned forward. Inside rested several folders, a bundle of letters tied with string, and a thick envelope labeled Final Evidence. The handwriting belonged to Harold. Walter felt his pulse quicken. The first folder contained photographs, hundreds of them. Volunteer crews clearing landslides, residents transporting supplies on horseback, families gathered inside temporary shelters, amateur radio operators working through the night, fire lookout personnel coordinating communications. The images transformed the storm from an event described on paper into something real, something personal. Walter slowly examined each photograph. Ordinary people filled every frame. None appeared famous. None seemed interested in recognition. Yet according to the records, they had saved lives. Emily carefully turned over one photograph. Names were written on the back, dates, locations. Harold had identified nearly everyone. He documented everything, she said quietly. Walter nodded. The realization no longer surprised him. It felt like part of who Harold was. The next folder contained witness statements. Dozens of them. Handwritten testimonies collected from volunteers, residents, and rescue workers after the storm. The accounts were extraordinary. People described carrying medicine through dangerous terrain, walking miles through snow and rain, opening homes to stranded families, organizing emergency shelters, repairing damaged communication lines. Again and again, the same theme emerged. Communities survived because ordinary people stepped forward when official resources could not reach them. Walter found himself unexpectedly emotional while reading. The stories reminded him of the people he worked beside throughout his own career. Utility crews restoring power after hurricanes, maintenance workers fixing infrastructure during emergencies, individuals whose contributions often went unnoticed. He understood these people. He understood why Harold refused to let them be forgotten. Then they opened the envelope marked "Final Evidence." The mood changed immediately. Inside were copies of official reports, correspondence between agencies, meeting summaries, and comparative records assembled by Harold over decades. Emily began reading. After several minutes, her expression darkened. "Walter?" He looked up. "What?" She slid several documents across the table. The evidence was difficult to ignore. Early drafts of official storm reports included references to volunteer rescue efforts. Specific names appeared. Entire sections described community involvement. Yet later versions removed many of those details. Not all, but enough to change the narrative significantly. Final reports focused heavily on agency responses and formal operations. Volunteer contributions were minimized or omitted altogether. Walter stared at the documents. "Why?" Emily slowly shook her head. "I don't know." More evidence followed. Meeting notes, internal memoranda, funding summaries. None suggested a grand conspiracy. Instead, the alterations appeared gradual, administrative, bureaucratic. The kind of decisions made by people prioritizing official narratives over complete ones. Yet the effect remained the same. Hundreds of volunteers slowly disappeared from the historical record. Harold had spent decades documenting the discrepancies. The proof sat right in front of them. Silence settled across the room. Finally, Walter spoke. How many people were forgotten? Emily looked around at the folders covering the table. Probably more than we'll ever know. The answer lingered heavily between them. Every discovery made the story larger, more meaningful, more personal. These weren't anonymous names in old records anymore. They were individuals, families, communities, people whose courage helped save lives during one of the region's most difficult disasters. Outside, darkness fully settled across the mountains. Neither noticed the passing hours. They continued reviewing documents until well after nightfall. Harold's sacrifice became increasingly clear with every file. He had devoted decades of his life to preserving evidence most people never cared to examine. He organized archives, conducted interviews, collected photographs, tracked missing records, protected stories. Not because anyone paid him, not because recognition awaited him, simply because he believed the truth mattered. Walter found himself staring at one particular photograph. Harold stood beside a group of volunteers shortly after the storm. Everyone looked exhausted. Mud covered their boots. Rain jackets hung loosely from tired shoulders. Yet they were smiling. The image captured something powerful: service, community, purpose. Walter realized he understood his uncle better than ever before. The man had spent his life protecting something larger than himself. A sharp knock at the door interrupted the moment. Both froze. Visitors rarely arrived at the lookout after dark. Walter crossed the room and opened the door. Ben Ortega stood outside holding a flashlight. The retired ranger looked unusually serious. "Sorry to come this late," he said. Walter immediately sensed something was wrong. "What's happened?" Ben stepped inside and glanced at the documents covering the table. His expression suggested he already knew exactly what they had found. "I figured you were getting close." Emily exchanged a glance with Walter. "Close to what?" Ben slowly removed his hat and sat down. For several moments he remained silent. Then he looked directly at them. "There was a meeting after the storm." Walter felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of meeting?" Ben exhaled heavily. "One most people don't know about." The room grew quiet. Even the wind outside seemed to fade. Finally, Ben continued. "Harold was there. So was I." He looked down at the photographs scattered across the table. "And what happened in that meeting explains why so many of those people disappeared from the official story." Ben remained at the lookout well past midnight. Rain tapped softly against the windows while lantern light illuminated the documents spread across the table. Walter and Emily listened carefully as the retired ranger described events he had not spoken about in decades. The secret meeting took place several months after the 1974 storm. Representatives from emergency agencies, local government offices, and regional administrators gathered to review the disaster response. Volunteers were not invited. Neither were most lookout operators. Harold attended only because several communication records remained in his possession. "People expected the meeting to be about preparedness," Ben said quietly. "Improving response plans, fixing mistakes." He paused. Instead, most of the discussion focused on official reporting. Walter frowned. "Reporting?" Ben nodded. Who would receive credit? Which organizations would appear in the final summaries? What information would be emphasized? Silence settled across the room. The explanation wasn't dramatic. It didn't involve conspiracies or secret plots. In some ways, that made it more troubling. The erasure happened through ordinary decisions, administrative choices, budget concerns, public relations priorities. One section of a report removed here. One volunteer group omitted there. One community effort summarized instead of detailed. Over time, entire portions of the story disappeared. "Harold hated it," Ben said. "He spent years trying to correct the record." Walter looked toward the lockbox documents. Everything finally made sense. Harold wasn't preserving evidence because he wanted recognition for himself. He was protecting people who never received the recognition they deserved. The next several weeks became the busiest Walter had experienced in years. Word of the archive quietly spread among historians, researchers, and local historical societies. Emily helped coordinate verification efforts. Every claim needed documentation. Every name required confirmation. Every photograph had to be identified. The process was slow, careful, necessary. Yet the results proved remarkable. The more records they examined, the stronger the evidence became. Volunteer rescue teams documented in Harold's files matched independent accounts preserved in family collections. Radio transmissions aligned with weather reports. Journal entries matched newspaper articles and emergency records. Piece by piece, the forgotten story emerged. One afternoon, Emily arrived carrying a box of photocopied census records and local directories. Her excitement was obvious before she even entered the lookout. "I found them!" Walter looked up from a stack of communication logs. "Found who?" Emily placed the documents on the table. "Descendants." She began pointing toward highlighted names. "Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of people involved in the rescue effort. Families still living throughout the region. Many had no idea their relatives played significant roles during the storm. Some remembered stories passed down through generations. Others knew almost nothing. Walter spent the rest of the afternoon making phone calls alongside Emily. The conversations were emotional. One woman cried after learning her grandfather helped coordinate supply deliveries during the storm. Another family shared photographs preserved in an attic for nearly 50 years. Several descendants expressed disbelief that anyone still remembered the events. The calls transformed the investigation. These weren't just names on paper anymore. They were people, families, legacies. The stakes suddenly felt larger. Entire communities had lost recognition for contributions that helped save lives. That realization stayed with Walter long after the calls ended. A few days later, another breakthrough arrived. While reviewing Harold's inventory notebooks, Emily noticed repeated references to communication archives that still had not been recovered. The missing radio logs continued bothering both of them. According to Harold's records, they existed, yet they remained absent from the storage shed, the lockbox, and the lookout itself. He had to put them somewhere, Emily said. Walter agreed. Harold never discarded anything. If the logs survived, they were hidden intentionally. The answer emerged from an overlooked detail buried inside one of Harold's correspondence files. A former lookout operator referenced preserving recordings within relay storage. Neither Walter nor Emily recognized the term initially. Then Ben did. The old relay station. Walter looked up immediately. What relay station? Ben smiled faintly. Everyone forgot about it. The next morning, they followed Ben into the mountains. Several miles from the lookout, hidden among dense trees, stood a small communications building abandoned decades earlier. The structure was barely visible beneath vegetation, yet inside, protected from weather and time, they found exactly what Harold had been searching for. Shelves lined with recording reels, communication transcripts, archived radio logs, hundreds of them. Emily carefully lifted one container and stared at the label. October 1974. Emergency traffic. Walter felt a chill. The missing logs had finally been found. Over the following days, they restored and reviewed portions of the recordings. Voices crackled through old speakers, requests for help, supply coordination, rescue updates, volunteer reports. Entire communities working together during crisis. The recordings provided direct evidence supporting Harold's archive. More importantly, they preserved voices unheard for nearly half a century. Yet just as progress accelerated, a new obstacle emerged. Walter returned from town one afternoon to find two expensive SUVs parked near the trailhead below the lookout. Several professionally dressed individuals waited nearby. The lead representative introduced himself as part of a development company. "Mr. Hayes," he said politely, "we're interested in discussing the property." Walter immediately recognized the situation. The lookout and surrounding acreage. The man smiled. "We understand you recently inherited it." What followed felt less like a conversation and more like pressure disguised as negotiation. The company presented maps, proposals, and financial projections. Tourism development, luxury cabins, scenic attractions. They offered more money than Walter expected. Far more. Yet something about their timing bothered him. The archive discoveries were becoming known. Historians were asking questions, families were reconnecting with forgotten stories, and suddenly developers seemed unusually interested in acquiring the mountain. Walter declined politely. The representatives remained courteous, but before leaving, one of them offered a warning disguised as advice. Opportunities don't stay available forever. The comment lingered long after they departed. That evening, Walter climbed back to the lookout feeling unsettled. The pressure was increasing. The history mattered more than ever. Somewhere ahead, important decisions waited. As sunset painted the mountains gold, he returned to organizing Harold's materials. The work helped clear his thoughts. Hours passed quietly. Then, while sorting correspondence inside a small wooden cabinet near the radio console, Walter noticed something he had somehow overlooked. A sealed envelope hidden beneath a false bottom. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Harold's. The message consisted of only 3 words. For Walter alone. His pulse quickened immediately. Outside, darkness settled across the mountains. Inside the lookout, surrounded by decades of preserved history, Walter carefully lifted the envelope into his hands. Harold's final letter had been waiting there all along. Walter carried Harold's envelope to the observation deck and sat beside the windows overlooking the mountains. Evening shadows stretched across the valleys below. The radio console hummed softly nearby, its aged equipment glowing beneath small indicator lights. For several moments, he simply stared at the letter resting in his hands. Everything they had discovered over the past weeks seemed to lead here. The journals, the radio transmissions, the hidden records, the lockbox, the forgotten heroes. Somehow, Harold had anticipated all of it. Finally, Walter broke the seal. The first line immediately stopped him. If you are reading this, then you listened to the radio. Walter smiled despite himself. It sounded exactly like Harold. Direct, practical. The letter continued. Harold explained why he left the lookout to Walter specifically. Not because they were close. In truth, they barely knew one another. Harold admitted that openly. Instead, he chose Walter because he spent a lifetime doing work most people overlooked, fixing problems quietly, keeping systems running, showing up when needed. Harold believed Walter understood something important. The people who matter most during difficult times are often the people history forgets first. Walter stared out the window for a moment before continuing. The words struck deeper than he expected. Since losing his job, he had struggled with feeling unnecessary, invisible, like the useful part of his life had already ended. Somehow, Harold had seen through that long before Walter inherited the tower. The letter shifted toward the mystery. Harold confirmed many of the suspicions they had developed. The 1974 storm changed everything. Communities survived because volunteers, lookout operators, amateur radio enthusiasts, ranchers, loggers, and ordinary residents worked together when official resources became overwhelmed. The rescue network functioned because people trusted one another. Yet over time, much of that story faded. Harold never believed the omissions were entirely malicious. Bureaucracy had its own momentum. Reports simplified events. Administrators changed. Records disappeared. Priorities shifted. Eventually, the official version became the accepted version. Harold could not accept that. So he spent decades preserving evidence. Interviews, maps, logs, photographs, correspondence, anything that helped tell the complete story. Then Walter reached the final section of the letter. His pulse quickened. There is one archive left. The words appeared underlined twice. Everything else was only preparation. The complete collection remains inside the lookout. Walter sat upright immediately. The complete collection. Harold included detailed instructions. specific measurements, reference points, construction notes, directions leading toward a location hidden within the structure itself. By the time Emily arrived the next morning, Walter already knew where they needed to search. Together, they followed Harold's instructions carefully. The clues led them beneath the observation level, behind a series of storage compartments most people would never notice. Harold had modified portions of the lookout years earlier. The changes blended so naturally into the structure that they remained invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. "This man really liked hiding things," Emily muttered. Walter laughed softly. "I'm starting to think he enjoyed it." Several hours passed before they found the concealed access panel, hidden behind shelving near the base of the tower. It opened into a narrow space between structural supports. Walter shined his flashlight inside and immediately froze. Shelves stretched into the darkness. Metal cabinets lined the walls. Archive boxes occupied every available surface. For several moments, neither spoke. "You've got to be kidding me," Emily whispered. Walter slowly climbed inside. The space wasn't enormous, but it was packed with materials, hundreds of boxes, thousands of pages, decades of collected evidence. The Master Archive, Harold's true life's work. The following days passed in a whirlwind. Historians, archivists, and researchers traveled to the mountain after Emily quietly contacted trusted colleagues. Every discovery strengthened the story. Original radio recordings, volunteer rosters, personal interviews, emergency communication transcripts, weather records, maps showing rescue routes, testimony from residents, internal memoranda, correspondence. The archive connected everything. Most importantly, it answered lingering questions. Missing records appeared. Missing names returned. Missing context emerged. The complete story finally existed in one place. Walter spent long hours helping organize materials. He barely noticed how different he felt compared to the man who first arrived at the lookout. Back then, his days felt empty, directionless. Now, each morning arrived with purpose. Every box opened revealed another forgotten voice, another family, another piece of history worth protecting. Yet alongside the excitement came pressure. A regional historical commission had agreed to review the evidence. If successful, the story could receive official recognition. Educational programs could be developed. Historical designations might follow. The hearing represented the best opportunity to restore the forgotten legacy. Unfortunately, it was approaching fast. Very fast. 3 weeks, Emily said while reviewing schedules. Walter looked up. "That's all?" She nodded. 3 weeks. Suddenly, every hour mattered. Documentation needed organization. Claims required verification. Exhibits had to be prepared. Audio recordings restored. Descendants contacted. Historians consulted. The workload felt overwhelming, yet nobody considered slowing down. Momentum continued building. One evening, while reviewing materials from the Master Archive, Walter noticed something remarkable. The evidence no longer consisted of scattered clues. Everything connected. Harold's journals matched the radio logs. The radio logs matched weather reports. Weather reports matched eyewitness testimony. Testimony matched photographs and volunteer records. Piece by piece, an unbroken chain formed. Complete proof. Walter stood before a wall covered in timelines, maps, photographs, and documents. Emily joined him. For several moments, they simply looked. "He did it," she said quietly. Walter nodded. "Harold." "He preserved enough." The statement carried enormous weight. After decades of effort, Harold succeeded. The evidence existed. The truth survived. Now it simply needed to be shared. Late that night, after Emily returned home, Walter remained alone in the lookout. Wind moved softly through the mountains. The radio crackled occasionally with bursts of static. He walked through the archive one final time before bed. Photographs, journals, maps, recordings, lives, stories, sacrifices. Everything waiting to be remembered again. On a nearby table rested the first draft of his presentation for the Historical Commission hearing. Walter picked it up and read through the opening pages. His hands no longer shook. The uncertainty that followed his layoff had largely disappeared. Something had changed. He finally understood why Harold chose him. The old radio emitted a brief burst of static behind him. Walter turned and looked toward the console. Then he smiled. In a few weeks, he would stand before historians, officials, descendants, and community leaders. He would tell them about the storm, the rescue network, the forgotten heroes, the voices preserved across decades. And for the first time since inheriting the lookout, he believed they were finally ready to listen. The hearing room reached capacity nearly an hour before the session began. People filled every seat. Additional chairs lined the walls. Reporters occupied the rear rows. Historians organized folders and notebooks across long tables. Descendants of volunteers, lookout operators, ranchers, radio enthusiasts, and rescue workers sat beside one another. Many meeting for the first time. Several carried old photographs recovered from attics and family albums. Others brought letters, journals, and keepsakes connected to the storm. The atmosphere felt less like an administrative hearing and more like a reunion decades overdue. Walter stood near the entrance reviewing his notes. His presentation rested inside a worn leather binder. Emily moved through the crowd helping researchers organize exhibits. Ben sat quietly near the front, looking both nervous and proud. For a moment, Walter simply observed the room. Months earlier, he had been sitting alone in a nearly empty house, wondering what purpose remained in his life. Now, hundreds of people had gathered because of a mystery hidden inside a mountain lookout. The realization still felt unreal. Then he saw Sarah. His daughter stood near the back of the room, holding a travel bag over one shoulder. Walter blinked twice before he was certain she was really there. "Dad?" Sarah smiled. Walter crossed the room immediately. The hug came naturally, without awkwardness or hesitation. They had spoken more often over the previous months than they had in years. The investigation created unexpected opportunities to reconnect. Yet seeing her there mattered more than any phone call. "I wasn't going to miss this," she said. Walter laughed softly. "It's a long drive. Worth it." Sarah looked around the room. "You've done something incredible." The words stayed with him long after they found seats together. The hearing began shortly afterward. Historical Commission members reviewed preliminary reports before inviting Walter to speak. The room grew quiet as he approached the podium. He wasn't a professional presenter. He wasn't a historian. He wasn't even particularly comfortable speaking in front of large groups. Yet as he looked across the audience, he felt surprisingly calm. These stories deserved to be told. That mattered more than nerves. He began with Harold, the lonely mountain lookout, the old radio, the inheritance nobody wanted. Then he described the discoveries, the journals, the hidden archives, the missing records, the forgotten rescue network. One by one, photographs appeared on large screens behind him. Faces filled the room. Volunteers carrying supplies through snow. Families sheltering neighbors. Radio operators working through the night, residents repairing roads and communication lines. The evidence followed: communication logs, maps, weather reports, testimony, audio recordings. Every piece reinforced the same truth. Communities survived because ordinary people worked together during extraordinary circumstances. Then Emily presented the restored radio transmissions. Crackling voices echoed through the hearing chamber: calls for help, supply requests, location updates, volunteer reports. People who had been silent for nearly 50 years suddenly spoke again. The effect was powerful. Some audience members wiped away tears. Others sat perfectly still, listening to voices they never expected to hear. Several descendants recognized names belonging to relatives. One elderly woman quietly cried while listening to a recording containing her father's voice. The room felt transformed. History was no longer abstract. It was alive. When the final evidence appeared, the narrative became impossible to ignore. Harold's archive demonstrated how portions of the rescue effort gradually disappeared from official records. Not through a single decision, not through malice, through omission, simplification, administrative convenience. Yet the effect remained the same. Hundreds of volunteers slowly vanished from the story. Until now. The hearing continued for hours. Historians verified records. Archivists authenticated materials. Descendants shared family accounts supported by the evidence. Researchers presented timelines connecting every discovery. Piece by piece, the complete story emerged. By the end of the day, no serious questions remained. The proof was overwhelming. The forgotten rescuers were finally being recognized. When the commission announced its decision, the room erupted in applause. The rescue network would receive formal historical recognition. Educational materials would be developed. The archive would be preserved. Official records would be updated to reflect the complete story. Families embraced one another. Tears flowed freely. Ben sat quietly with his head lowered for several moments before wiping his eyes. Emily smiled through tears of her own. Walter simply stood there and listened. Harold's mission was complete. Outside the hearing room, Sarah wrapped her arms around him again. "Mom would be proud," she said softly. Walter looked away for a moment. The mention of his wife still carried emotion after all these years. Yet this time it wasn't painful. It felt comforting. "I hope so," he said. Sarah smiled. "I know so." Their relationship continued healing over the following months. The distance that had quietly grown between them began disappearing. Phone calls became regular. Visits became common. For the first time in years, neither felt like they were trying to reconnect. They simply were. Shortly after the hearing, the development company returned with another offer. This one was even larger than before. Enough money to solve every financial problem Walter might ever face. The representatives arrived confident. They left disappointed. Walter never seriously considered selling. The lookout meant something entirely different now. It wasn't property. It was responsibility. The decision surprised nobody who truly understood the story. Over the next year, grants, donations, volunteers, and historical organizations helped transform the site. The lookout was carefully restored. Archives were organized. Exhibits were designed. Recordings were preserved. Educational programs were developed. What began as a forgotten tower became something far more meaningful. The reopening ceremony took place the following summer. Hundreds of visitors climbed the mountain. Families arrived carrying photographs and stories. Students came with notebooks and cameras. historians traveled from across the state. Descendants of the rescuers gathered together beneath clear blue skies. Above the entrance, a new sign welcomed visitors: the Mountain Signal Heritage Center. Near the doorway stood a bronze plaque mounted on native stone. People stopped to read the inscription before entering. Some voices fade from the airwaves. Their courage should never fade from memory. Inside, visitors explored exhibits filled with maps, journals, photographs, weather reports, communication logs, and restored recordings. Children listened to radio transmissions through headphones. Families discovered relatives featured in photographs and documents. Students learned how isolated communities once depended upon one another for survival. The old radio remained exactly where Harold left it, carefully preserved behind protective glass. More people stopped there than anywhere else. They stood quietly, listening to recordings of voices carried across mountains decades earlier. As evening approached, the crowds gradually thinned. The final visitors began making their way down the trail. Golden sunlight stretched across distant ridges. Shadows filled the valleys below. Walter climbed the stairs to the observation level one last time. The lookout was quiet again, not empty, peaceful. He stood beside the windows and watched the sun slowly disappear beyond the mountains. The radio sat nearby. For a moment, it emitted a soft burst of static. Walter smiled. The sound no longer felt mysterious. He knew exactly what it represented. Lives, stories, sacrifices, history. He thought about Harold, about Emily, about Ben, about Sarah, about all the forgotten people whose courage had finally returned to the story where it belonged. Then he looked across the endless mountains stretching toward the horizon. For the first time since losing his job, he no longer felt like a man left behind. He felt like a man who had finally answered the call meant for him. In 1974, a catastrophic mountain storm trapped dozens of residents, firefighters, and volunteers across isolated communities. A network of fire lookout operators coordinated rescues using radio communications. Several local volunteers risked and, in some cases, lost their lives saving others. Government reports later credited official agencies, while minimizing the contributions of local residents and volunteer operators. Harold secretly preserved radio logs, journals, maps, and testimony proving what really happened. The working radio becomes the key that leads Walter to the hidden archive. The story restores recognition to forgotten heroes and gives Walter a renewed sense of purpose.